There's a mountain that doesn't forgive, a place where the air slices your lungs and time itself feels frozen, suspended between life and death. They call it K2. In 1954, a young American climber named Art Gilkey vanished here, swallowed by a storm so violent it erased him from the face of the earth. His body was never found, but his story, it refused to stay buried. For decades, whispers of that expedition haunted the climbing world. Some say he was a hero who gave his life to save others. Others think he didn't fall at all, that something or someone let him go. When his name resurfaced on Reddit in 2021, comparing his tragedy to the disastrous 2008 K2 deaths, a new generation asked the same question that echoed through the ice for 70 years. What really happened to Art Gilkey on K2? This is not just a story about a man. It's a story about loyalty, fear, and the price of trust, when death is only a heartbeat away. If stories like these move you, real people, real sacrifice, subscribe to K2 Stories, where every climb reveals the human soul at its most fragile and its most fearless. Now, let's go back to 1954, the year K2 demanded its due. Arthur Carr Gilkey, or simply Art as his friends called him, wasn't born into fame or fortune. He came from the rolling farmlands of Iowa, the son of a modest family that valued hard work, decency, and faith. In his early years, there was nothing to suggest he would one day challenge one of the most dangerous mountains on earth. But Art had a quiet restlessness, a longing for something larger than the horizon he grew up with. He excelled in geology at Iowa State University, drawn to the raw story written in stone and earth. To him, mountains weren't just piles of rock. They were living records of time shaped by wind, ice, and struggle. Maybe that's why he saw himself in them. By the time he finished his studies, the world was still reeling from World War II. Art, like many young Americans, served his time with quiet patriotism, returning home with both discipline and scars you couldn't see. Yet instead of retreating into comfort, he sought challenge, places where clarity could be found above the noise of the world. In the early 1950s, mountaineering was no longer a gentleman's hobby. It was a battlefield for glory. Everest had been conquered in 1953, and newspapers buzzed with names like Hillary and Norgay. But to a small circle of American climbers, Everest was just a trophy. K2, the savage mountain, was the real test, where 1 in 4 climbers never came back. That statistic didn't scare Art. It fascinated him. He often said to his friend Charlie Houston, the expedition leader, "If I'm going to spend my life studying mountains, I'd better know what they feel like up close." Houston admired him, not for bravado, but for conviction. Art wasn't reckless. He was deeply thoughtful, even tender in his manner. But behind those calm eyes burned something fierce, the desire to belong to something extraordinary. The 1953 American expedition to K2 had failed, crushed by storms and exhaustion. Yet Houston wasn't done. He began planning another attempt, this time with a small hand-picked team, men he trusted with his life. Among them was Art Gilkey, now a 27-year-old geologist, quiet but strong with a reputation for endurance and optimism even in the worst conditions. He wasn't just there to climb, he was the team's scientist. His mission was to study the mountain's glacial formations and record geological data for future expeditions. But deep down, everyone knew, including Art himself, that he wanted to stand where no American had ever stood, on the summit of K2. The stakes were enormous. America's pride in mountaineering was on the line. But for Art, it was simpler than that. He wasn't chasing fame or headlines. He once wrote in his journal, "If I die up there, it'll be in a place that makes sense to me." That quiet acceptance, the understanding that beauty and danger often live side by side, would define his journey and his fate. By the summer of 1954, the team was ready. 8 men, 1 dream, and a mountain that had already buried more than its share of dreams. Before a man can face K2, he must face himself. For Art Gilkey, that meant endless months of preparation, physically, mentally, and spiritually. The mountain didn't care how brilliant your degree was, or how pure your intentions seemed. It only respected strength, precision, and humility. In the early spring of 1954, Art joined Charlie Houston and his chosen team in the rugged mountain ranges of Alaska. It was a proving ground, a rehearsal for the real thing. The air was bitter and thin, the climbs relentless, the snow crusted with the kind of ice that could cut a man's face raw. And yet Art thrived. He wasn't the loudest man in camp. While others cursed the wind or the cold, he quietly adjusted his rope, checked the knots of others, and smiled through the frost that gathered on his beard. He carried more weight than most, never complained, and somehow always found words of encouragement when morale sank. He was the kind of guy, Houston later said, you could trust with your life on a rope, because he had already given it to the team. But beneath that calm strength, there was tension. The 1954 K2 expedition would not just be another climb, it would be a test of endurance beyond reason. The U.S. Army and the American Alpine Club had placed immense expectations on Houston's team after their failed attempt in 1953. The press wanted redemption, the climbers wanted closure, and Art? He wanted purpose. He spent weeks studying geological maps, sketching ridges, and analyzing weather data. He knew K2's western face, the Abruzzi spur, like the lines on his hand. He wasn't climbing blind. He was climbing informed. Still, there were rules, unwritten laws that every climber respected, or at least pretended to. 1. Never climb above your limits. 2. Never endanger the team for your ambition. And 3. On K2, no one climbs for glory. You climb to survive. But those rules blur at altitude. When oxygen runs thin and time slows, the line between courage and recklessness becomes nearly invisible. In those final weeks before departure, Art began keeping a personal notebook, fragments of thought, sketches, reflections on mortality. One passage would later haunt readers. We chase peaks not because we hate life, but because we hope to understand it. That perhaps was his quiet defiance. He wasn't running from death. He was walking toward a deeper truth. The training intensified. They climbed ice walls, slept in sub-zero temperatures, and practiced rescue drills that no one hoped to use. By the end, the group had become something rare, not just a team, but a brotherhood. There was Bob Bates, the philosopher of the group, George Bell, the powerhouse, D. Molinar, the calm artist, and climber, and Pete Schoening, a young powerhouse known for his uncanny rope work. Together, they carried the weight of not just gear and oxygen, but of trust, the kind that only forms when every heartbeat depends on the next man's grip. When they finally stood at the base of K2 that summer, looking up at its icy spire piercing the clouds, silence fell among them. Even the wind seemed to pause. In that silence, Art smiled. "This," he whispered to Houston, "is what we came for." And the mountain, indifferent as ever, stared back, waiting to see which of them it would take. June 1954. The world below was green and alive, but here, at the foot of K2, everything was frozen in shades of white and silence. 8 men began their ascent into the clouds, the beginning of what would become one of mountaineering's most haunting stories. They followed the Abruzzi spur, a knife-edge ridge of ice and rock that sliced straight toward the sky. Every morning they woke to the sound of snow sliding off their tents, every night to the groan of glaciers shifting beneath them. Art Gilkey was the quiet heartbeat of the group. While others cursed the altitude, he noted geological features with a scientist's eye. "Look at the stratification," he murmured one morning, as if the mountain were a textbook instead of a death trap. But K2 was already testing them. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. Fingers went numb inside double-layered gloves. One by one, climbers began to suffer frostbite and altitude sickness. And yet, no one wanted to turn back. Not this time. At Camp 4, over 7,000 meters high, the air grew so thin that every breath burned. They were exhausted, but the summit looked close, deceptively close. They pushed higher, hauling loads up fixed ropes, inch by inch, as avalanches roared in the distance. Then came the wind. It started as a whisper, then rose to a scream, a storm so violent it pinned them in their tents for days. For 6 long days they lay trapped, rationing food, melting snow for water, and listening to the walls of the mountain groan. Some prayed. Others stared silently at the frozen tent fabric, knowing that one mistake could send them tumbling 2 miles down the slope. It was during that confinement that the first signs appeared. Subtle at first. Art complained of sharp pain in his legs. His calves swelled grotesquely, and purple veins crawled across the skin. At first they thought it was frostbite, but Houston, a trained doctor, recognized something far worse: thrombophlebitis, a massive blood clot forming in the veins of Art's leg. If it broke loose, it would travel to his lungs and kill him instantly. There was only one choice: get him down. But down meant thousands of feet through ice, crevasses, and storm. No rescue helicopter, no radio call. Just rope, courage, and each other. And so began one of the most selfless acts in mountaineering history. The 7 remaining men tied Art to a makeshift stretcher, a sleeping bag lashed to bamboo poles, and began the descent. They moved like a single organism, inching together down the mountain face. Each man risked his life every step to keep Art alive. At one point, an avalanche ripped past them, nearly taking the entire team. Snow blinded them, ropes froze solid, and every anchor felt like the last. Still, they refused to let go. Then came the infamous moment, the one that would echo for decades. As they descended a steep ice slope, the entire rope team suddenly slipped. 7 men, all tethered together, began sliding uncontrollably toward the abyss. Only one man, Pete Schoening, managed to jam his ice axe behind a boulder and hold the full weight of his teammates, saving every single one of them. It would later be called the belay, one of the greatest acts of heroism in climbing history. But their victory was fleeting. They were still high, still trapped in a storm, and Art was fading fast. By dusk, they reached a small ledge and anchored the stretcher for the night. Exhausted beyond measure, they huddled together, frost-bitten, delirious, whispering prayers no one expected to be answered. When dawn came, Art was gone. The ropes that had held his stretcher were cut clean, not frayed, not broken. Below them lay an endless sea of white, swallowing everything in silence. No one ever found his body. Not then. Not ever. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened on that ledge, whether the ropes gave way, or whether Art Gilkey, knowing he was doomed, freed himself to save his friends. Either way, the mountain had made its choice. When the storm finally broke, 7 men remained, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, and barely alive. They had descended through what felt like eternity, haunted by the emptiness where Art Gilkey should have been. No one spoke much during the descent. Words felt useless in that vast white silence. Each man carried his own version of the same question. Had Art fallen, or had he chosen to let go? When they reached base camp, the storm had erased all tracks. The mountain stood cold and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. Charlie Houston, exhausted and broken, wrote in his journal, "The mountain was quiet again, but it felt like it had taken something from all of us, not just Art." Back home, the news of Art Gilkey's death reached the United States quietly, overshadowed by post-war politics and the fading glow of Everest's triumph. There were no parades, no medals, no headlines, just a few lines in mountaineering journals and a whisper among climbers. The man who gave everything so others could live. The surviving team members, Houston, Bates, Bell, Molinar, Schoening, and the rest, never climbed K2 again. They called it their last mountain, not because they were afraid, but because it had already demanded everything they had to give. Years later, when asked about the expedition, Houston simply said, "We didn't fail. We came back with our humanity intact, and that's more than most who touch K2 can say." The image of that mountain haunted them for decades, steep ice walls disappearing into clouds, and somewhere up there, perhaps under layers of eternal snow, the memory of a man who refused to become a burden. In 1993, climbers discovered a body on K2, perfectly preserved by ice. They believed it might be Art Gilkey. His clothes matched, the location fit the timeline. But no one could be certain. The mountain had kept his secret for nearly 40 years. Somewhere in that frozen stillness, you can still imagine him, a young geologist who just wanted to understand the Earth, lying within the very layers of stone and ice he devoted his life to studying, and his team, now old men, would reunite in the twilight of their lives, decades later, not to conquer anything, but to remember. They spoke softly, laughed quietly, and fell silent when the wind blew. Because they knew, when K2 speaks, you listen. Art's story became legend in mountaineering circles, a lesson in loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. It wasn't the story of a failed climb. It was the story of what it means to be human in a place where humanity shouldn't survive. In the annals of mountaineering, few names carry the quiet weight of Art Gilkey. He never reached the summit, but in a way, he reached something far higher, a place where the best part of human nature stands against the cold. 70 years later, Art Gilkey's name still drifts through the climbing world like a ghost in the snow. Every generation that faces K2 eventually hears it, whispered around campfires, retold in base camp tents when the wind howls. Was he a hero, or simply a man who made the only choice left to him? That question divides climbers even now. Some believe Art's rope snapped, that the mountain simply claimed him. Others insist he cut himself loose to save the rest. The truth, buried beneath tons of shifting ice, will never be known. But maybe it doesn't need to be. Because whether he fell or let go, the meaning remains the same. When faced with the edge of existence, Art Gilkey chose others over himself. Mountaineering has changed since 1954. Better gear, better weather forecasts, satellite rescue. And yet, K2 remains as cruel and beautiful as ever. Every climber who steps onto its slopes enters a contract with the unknown. And in that thin space between courage and catastrophe, the story of Art Gilkey still lives. A reminder that sometimes greatness isn't found on the summit, but in the fall. If you've ever felt that pull, the desire to chase something vast, even knowing the risks, then you already understand Art. He wasn't climbing to conquer, he was climbing to belong. So the next time you see K2, in a photo or on a map, remember him. A man whose greatest act wasn't reaching the top, but proving that compassion can survive even where life can't. If you believe stories like this deserve to live, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the fragile edge between life and legend, subscribe to K2 Stories, because up here, every tale we tell helps the fallen live again.